This presentation is brought to you by American Civil War and UK history. This is England's Kings and Queens podcast. Hello everyone, I'm your host Daz, and this presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel and as a podcast from wherever you get your podcasts from. And if you're watching on YouTube, remember to hit that subscribe button and give us a big thumbs up. And to keep up to date with everything American Civil War and UK history, check out our website where you'll find blog posts, podcasts and links to all of our social media pages. The link is available in the podcast description. And joining me today is author and historian Nathen Amin. Welcome, mate.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a very warm one today. So good that we've got quite a fiery, interesting subject to get us through this rare heat with.
Yes. And again, it is the first ever episode of this genre of podcasts. And I'm really excited that Nathen is here to talk about one of his favourite people in history. Now, obviously, before we get into the actual talk, though, and the subject, Nathen, I always ask my guests the first time they come on my podcast, I would like to know how you first became interested in not just history, but obviously your favourite subject.
Yeah, I mean, I am not a qualified historian, if we take that to mean somebody who went to university and got history qualifications. I, in fact, studied journalism at university. Now, when I was a kid at school, I loved history, but my school made us make a decision for GCSE. We had to pick either geography or history, and I was regarded as being just much better at geography than I was history. So unfortunately, my path was pushed away from what is now obviously the best subject in the world. Coming around to my 20s, I was still interested in local history, and I just started to do a bit more digging deep into my family history, into the history around me, particularly Welsh history, something I've always been interested in. And one day I picked up a book on the Tudors, and it quickly became clear that every book on the Tudors jumped straight to Henry VIII. And quite frankly, I became bored very quickly of the whole romantic circus around Henry VIII. I noticed at the beginning of every book, there was something about this Welsh dad he had who won his crown in battle, and yet there was very little written about him when we go back to around 2008, 2009. So I started doing my own research into Henry VII, so I could write some blogs, some articles for my website. And quite frankly, it just grew. It grew from there. So it's very much a case of almost a mixture of boredom and a mixture of Henry VII being a Welsh king and a force of nature from my own backyard who very few people had done much work on, certainly in a public sphere. Fortunately, I was able to pick up that baton and run with it.
Awesome. Well, that's fantastic. It's like you go down the rabbit hole and that's it. So I did the same when I watched a movie called Gettysburg, and here we are now. But anyway, so thank you for explaining that. So as Nathen has said, we're going to talk about Henry VII, and again, very important king, as many are. But you know, as you said, it's going to change. It changes the country quite dramatically. So, okay. So early life and origins, Henry's lineage. It's quite complex. It's a mixture of Lancastrian and Tudor ties. Could you break down his family history and how it shaped his early life ambitions, especially, you know, like the significance of being a descendant of John of Galt?
Yeah, so Henry VII was born in Pembroke Castle on the 28th of January, 1457. And as you say, his family lineage was interesting. He was descended from Welsh, English, and French royal blood on both sides of his family tree, although it does need to be stressed that wasn't particularly that interesting for this period. I mean, Henry was born in 1457, just 2 years after the Wars of the Roses had erupted. And of course, the Wars of the Roses is a dynastic conflict that is centered around the fact that so many people do have royal descendancy. So Henry VII really didn't have anything much to boast about, but he did have that royal blood in his veins. Now, on his father's side, his father was Edmund Tudor, who had actually died 3 months before Henry was born. Edmund Tudor was the product of what can only be called a clandestine affair between a widowed Queen of England, the French Princess Catherine of Valois, and the Welsh squire Owen Tudor. Catherine of Valois is a sister and daughter of French kings, so that gives Henry his French connection. Owen Tudor is the product of a long line of Welshmen that dates back to some revered Welsh kings of the 7th, 8th, and 9th century. So Henry Tudor has a claim to an ancient bloodline on this island that predates the Plantagenets. That's going to be very important for his story going forward. And then on his mother's side, he is descended from Lady Margaret Beaufort, who was only 13 years old at the time of his birth, but was the most valuable and important heiress in England. She was descended from the Beaufort line, who were illegitimate children of John of Gaunt that were later legitimised. And these Beauforts give, through Margaret, Henry VII, a slim claim to the English throne, because John of Gaunt, of course, is one of those sons of Edward III. So it's a fascinating family tree that comes together in 1452 when Edmund Tudor is awarded Margaret Beaufort as his ward. And the reason for this is quite interesting. You see, Margaret Beaufort is a cousin of the Lancastrian king Henry VI. Edmund Tudor is the younger half-brother of Henry VI. And though we can't be certain of this, I speculate that Henry VI was looking to create an alternative Lancastrian line by combining his brother's bloodline with his cousin's bloodline, because his brother doesn't have any connection to the English throne, Edmund Tudor. By marrying Edmund Tudor to Margaret Beaufort, he combines two of these, what can we call them, quasi-Lancastrians, these Lancastrian, offshoots into one, and their product of their child would have a potent bloodline. We've got to remember, in 1452, Henry VI does not yet have an heir. He does go on to have an heir, but at this time, he doesn't have one. And in fact, that's probably a major reason why, during this period, Edmund Beaufort, Margaret's cousin, and Richard, Duke of York, are beginning to fall out, because both those men hate each other, but they also both have a claim to the English throne. So this is a very complex, chaotic period, the 1450s, and it does, of course, lead to an outbreak of war that we remember as the Wars of the Roses.
Thank you, Nathan. And I know you mentioned there that obviously his father dies quite early on. But he had two guardians, didn't he? He had Jasper Tudor and William Herbert. Is that right?
Yeah, he did. So initially, just as I say, Henry's father, Edmund, dies 3 months before Henry's born. The reason it's often given as plague, I don't buy that. I think Edmund Tudor was murdered. There's very good reasons to believe that. And one of the people who attacked him was a chap called William Herbert. Now, in Wales, during this period, you have two families vying for supremacy, the Herberts and the Tudors. Same as in England, you have multiple feuds taking place between the Nevilles and the Percys, the Courtenays and the Bonvilles, the Yorks and the Lancasters. This is a dynastic conflict taking place. In Wales, it's the Herberts and the Tudors. Now, Edmund Tudor, however he dies, and Jasper Tudor, Edmund Tudor's brother, takes control of his nephew, Henry Tudor. But the Wars of the Roses, continue to unravel, and the Lancastrians are booted off the English throne in 1461, and Jasper Tudor is chased from the kingdom. The new king is Edward IV, and Edward IV is the son of Richard of York. So we now have the Yorkists on the English throne. And Edward IV sends William Herbert to Pembroke Castle to try and capture Jasper Tudor. He does not find Jasper Tudor, but he does find a 4-year-old boy, Henry Tudor. And now, William Herbert, the enemy of Jasper Tudor, the man who possibly killed Edmund Tudor, now takes Henry Tudor into his family, and he raises him for the next 10 years at Raglan Castle near the Welsh border. So Henry Tudor is brought in to the Herbert family. I mean, that's a remarkable story in itself. And one wonders, what did they talk about over the dinner table?
So that's just giving me goosebumps. It's almost like he was kidnapped in a way. Would you say that?
I wouldn't say kidnapped per se, but Henry didn't have any choice in the matter.
Right, yeah.
His wardship became royal property, and Edward IV sold that wardship to William Herbert for the colossal figure of £1,000, which is a lot of money back then. They knew the value of this young Tudor boy. And it does seem what William Herbert is trying to do is he has a plan. He's going to marry Henry Tudor to his daughter, Maud. And he's almost going to create a union of the roses in Wales. His plan seems to be to bring the Herbert and the Tudor family together in one bloodline, and forevermore, Wales would be under his family's control. That was the plan anyway. But of course, Jasper Tudor was not going anywhere yet.
No, and again, obviously, excuse me for being because I don't know, I've never delved too deep into the Wars of the Roses because it's very complex, isn't it? So during this period when he's taken by William Herbert into the Herbert family, where is his mother at this point? And obviously, what does Jasper Tudor, does he try and get him back into the Tudor family? How does that work? It's very complex.
It is, yeah. So Margaret Beaufort's only 13 years old when
Wow,
Henry
yes,
was
she's still
born.
young. Yeah.
Still young. She's still a child, and this certainly was not normal for the period. But once she is back up and running, essentially, because she's still a child, she becomes Jasper's ward. She was Edmund and Jasper's ward together. She's now just Jasper's because Edmund obviously died. And Jasper doesn't really have... perhaps he doesn't have the time, the money, perhaps he doesn't have the inclination to be Margaret's guardian. So a marriage is quickly arranged. So Margaret undertakes her second marriage by the age of just 13 when she's married to a son of the Duke of Buckingham. And this in itself is part of the Wars of the Roses, because the Duke of Buckingham and Jasper Tudor are two Lancastrian noblemen in Wales. And they're looking to create a political alliance through this marriage. And essentially, Margaret Beaufort goes off to live married life with the Duke of Buckingham's son. She is not the personal caregiver for her son. Her son remains in Pembroke until William Herbert takes him to Raglan. Margaret Beaufort is off in Lincolnshire and, undertaking her married life. She doesn't see her son much across the next decade. And this is an interesting decade because this is the 1460s. The Yorkists become the royal house in 1461. Henry Tudor is moved to Raglan Castle that year. And for the next 9 years, the Yorkists are in complete control of the kingdom. Jasper Tudor is in exile. He's going around moving from France to Scotland and back, trying to keep the Lancastrian cause alive. Every now and then he's able to invade Wales and cause some issues for the Herberts, but otherwise he's just in exile trying to keep a dying cause alive. And it does seem like the Yorkists have won until we get to 1469 and a certain chap named Warwick, who's going to be remembered as Warwick the Kingmaker for very good reasons, he defects from Edward IV's side. He leads a series of rebellions that result in the Lancastrians coming back to the English throne. And in the process of that, William Herbert's men attack and kill William Herbert at the Battle of Edgecote Moor. Again, the Wars of the Roses is very complex. We could do 100 podcasts going through every little episode that takes place. But suffice to say, the key point is William Herbert is executed during one battle. The Lancastrians invade England After 9 years off the throne, they take the throne back, and Jasper is back. And the first thing Jasper does is he goes straight to find his nephew. And nephew and uncle are reunited after 9 years apart. I mean, they barely knew each other. And I think there's a very interesting aspect here that people have never touched upon, which is Henry Tudor is now a 14-year-old boy. He spent 10 years being raised by the Herberts. Is it possible he grieved for William Herbert, the father figure, the only father figure he knew, and now Jasper's back? Again, I imagine there were some very interesting discussions taking place whilst they got to know each other again.
Wow, it's absolutely fascinating. It's definitely, I might be going down some rabbit holes, Nathan, I think. Anyway, yeah, I'd like to go back to Henry because again, so he actually ends up being exiled, doesn't he, to Brittany? So why and how does that go about? Is that because of this complex relationship that he's now got with this, guy that he's never, Jasper Tudor, he's never really known?
It's not directly because of that. In fact, Jasper would become the reason that Henry Tudor exists and becomes the reason we're even talking about him today. So the Lancastrians take back the English throne in 1471, but it's a shaky, crumbling alliance. You've got Warwick the Kingmaker, the man who, above all, kicked the Lancastrians off the throne in the first place, now at the centre of this Lancastrian revival, trying to keep the peace with Lancastrian veterans who hated him, and also the Lancastrian queen, Margaret of Anjou, who hated him. And it's a crumbling alliance, and it does begin to collapse. At the same time, Edward IV, who has left the country after being kicked off the throne, invades England with a massive army and simply takes back his crown. He defeats the Lancastrians in two battles, the Battle of Barnet and the Battle of Tewkesbury, and he completely annihilates the Lancastrian leadership. Within a few days of the Battle of Tewkesbury, which was fought in May 1471, the Lancastrian leadership has been decimated. Henry VI, the Lancastrian king, is killed, murdered. His son, Prince Edward, the future of Lancaster, 17 years old, is killed. The next two in line with royal blood on the Lancastrian side, John and Edmund Beaufort, they are also murdered. So Edward IV is, in the words of one chronicler, has chosen to crush the seed. He is looking to cut the head off the Lancastrian snake, and so he gets rid of everyone he can with royal blood. Now, Jasper and Henry Tudor were on the way to the Battle of Tewkesbury when they got held up. They got delayed, and it was a delay that saved their lives, because if they had been at Tewkesbury, they would have been killed as well. What Jasper's able to do is he's able to get hold of his nephew, who he knows has Lancastrian blood in his veins. He escapes to a Welsh seaside town called Tenby, and there, tradition tells us, using underground tunnels, the Tudors are able to get to a small boat, and they're able to escape out into the sea. They were headed for France, where, remember, from that family tree, the Tudors are related to French royalty. They are Jasper is the son of Catherine of Valois, the French princess. They try to get to France, but a storm blows them off course, and they end up in Brittany, which is then an independent duchy. And they claim asylum. And for the next 10 years, the Tudors are trapped in Brittany. They're not allowed to leave. They're guarded very closely in a series of castles, and they're essentially just waiting for the moment that the Duke of Brittany finally agrees a deal with the English king to have them handed over and executed. It is a difficult 10 years for the Tudors.
Wow, so interesting. Really is. Okay, so that 10 years goes by, and again, you said they're waiting for this, to be transported back to England, and that obviously doesn't happen, does it? So explain how that goes about and how we end up with is it the next king on the throne, which is Richard III? Is that, would I be right in saying that?
Not yet. There is the shaky
Whoa.
matter of Edward the Fourth,
Yeah.
and then Edward the Fifth, one of the princes in the Tower.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, just quickly on the Brittany point, just to try and emphasize a key characteristic when it comes to Henry VII, Henry Tudor. It's often pointed out that he was a paranoid and suspicious king, but people never look into the reasons why. So at 14 years old, he's had to escape through these underground tunnels to try and escape people trying to kill him. In Brittany, there are two major episodes we should quickly cover. When he's 19 years old, the Bretons sign a deal with the English. They are swayed by chests of English gold to hand over Henry Tudor, and he's arrested and given to English ambassadors, and he's taken to a ship in the port of St. Malo, and he's about to get on that ship. And if he does get on that ship, he's being brought back to England where he's going to be killed. A fight breaks out, and Henry is able to use this as a distraction to fake an illness. Whilst he's faking an illness, people obviously take his eyes off him, and he runs. And he runs like hell through the streets of St. Malo until he finds a church where he can hide. The English have to return home empty-handed. Now, fast forward a little bit in our story, we get to 1483. Edward IV dies, aged 40, and his son is the 12-year-old Edward V. We're not going to go into this today. We don't have the time.
No.
But for whatever reason,
Whoa.
Richard III decides that he should be king, and he takes the throne himself. His nephew, Edward V, is placed into the Tower of London with his brother, Prince Richard, and they disappear, and we do not know to this day what happened to them. They might have survived, they might have been murdered, we do not know. We can only speculate over the fate of the princes in the
Yeah.
Tower. But the point is, there's a new king of England, Richard III, and some people within the House of York, they don't support or like what he's done. So Richard III, by becoming king, creates a new civil war. It's not really the Wars of the Roses anymore. That was fixed back in 1471 when Edward IV snuffed out all the major Lancastrians. In 1483, it's a new civil war, and it's between the House of York and the House of York, because Richard has upset half of the House of York, and they now leave his side, and they look for somebody else to make king instead. The person that eyes come to rest upon is Henry Tudor, who's over there in Brittany, outside Richard's grasp, and who has a slight claim to the throne. Richard hears about this, and he sends across more gold to the Bretons to try and have Henry turned over. And again, the Bretons agree. The date is set for Henry's arrest. The day before, there's a spy, there's a betrayer in Richard's network, and somebody lets Henry know he's going to be arrested. So just before he's about to be arrested, he goes out for a walk one night, and then he suddenly leaves the road. He puts on the disguise of a peasant, and he gets on a horse and he rides. And we're told that he rides for a whole day until he reaches the French border and he's able to cross into France. The people who were chasing him to arrest him and kill him were only 1 hour behind. So this is the third escape Henry's made before he's even king. So we can understand why he was paranoid. We can understand why he was suspicious and cautious of the people around him. Once he's in France, the French hate the English. The French hate Richard III. They want to cause him some problems because Richard III is banging on that he's going to reopen the 100 Years' War, and the French do not want this to happen. So the French decide they're going to send Henry Tudor across to England with an army to just, distract Richard III. The French don't really think Henry's going to go and win. It's just about distracting Richard from his own war with France. But of course, history didn't turn out that way.
Whoa, it's so interesting. My goodness. Honestly, I definitely want to learn more about this like myself now. Wow. And as you said, he's going to come over and there's going to be probably, would you say, one of the most famous battles in British history?
It's definitely one of the most famous battles in history. One of the most consequential, of course. Although nobody fighting that day would know, of course, how history
Yeah, of
itself
course. Yeah.
would unravel. But it's hard to look past 1485 as one of those seminal dates in English history.
Yeah. And so would you like to take us through the Battle of Bosworth field, if you would then, please,
Uh,
Nate?
I'll do it. I'll do it quite brief as I
Yeah,
can,
that's
but cover,
fine. Yeah,
yeah,
brief overview is great, mate.
but cover the central points.
Yes.
Henry Tudor invades with a small army of Frenchmen and only 500 Englishmen. He lands in Wales, his ancestral homeland, where he claims to be the son of prophecy, the national deliverer who's returned to rescue the Welsh. That causes great support in Wales, and he picks up a couple of thousand Welshmen, and he keeps on marching through Wales until he reaches the heart of England. His army, again, is very diverse. It's mainly French, heavily Welsh, some English, and a couple of Scots along for a fight.
You got to have Scots.
Yeah, the Scots come along for a couple of, did you want to come along to batter some Englishmen? Um, they get to a place called Bosworth, the Bosworth area today, and facing them across the ridge is the mighty English Royal Army led by Richard III. The battle commences. If this was a sporting contest, Richard III would be the favourite. Richard III has got everything in his favour to win the day. But at a crucial point in this battle, whilst the Tudor side is holding their own because of the mighty valour of the great John de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, there's a betrayal on Richard's side. The Stanley faction, who have been watching this battle from the sidelines, they now come rushing down the ridge. They come straight into the centre of the battle, and they do so on Henry Tudor's side. The Stanleys switch sides, betray Richard III, and turn the day in Henry Tudor's favour. And there's very good reason for this, of course, because we haven't covered it. But the leader of the Stanleys, Thomas Stanley, is by this point Henry Tudor's stepfather. Yes, Margaret Beaufort is married again in her life. She's married Thomas Stanley, and he's now chosen, and his brother William Stanley have now chosen to defect. You can see their reasoning. If they've got a stepson and a stepnephew on the English throne, the paths to riches are open to them forevermore. And I will just mention, Thomas Stanley was rewarded by becoming the first Earl of Derby. Today, this very day, we still have a direct, unbroken line of Stanleys holding the earldom. The current Stanley is Edward Stanley. He's the 19th Earl of Derby. I've met him and given a talk for him, and he's worth about £6,700 million. So this was a very good gambit by Thomas Stanley at Bosworth. It worked. It worked for the Stanley, put it that way. Richard is encircled. He's overwhelmed. He's pulled from his horse. And despite showing incredible bravery that day, he dies like the warrior that he was. We've all by now seen the documentary, or we've heard about the exhumation of his remains in 2014.
Yes.
We know the horrific manner in which he died, but we should also make sure to praise his bravery. But
Yes.
the bottom line is, by the early afternoon of the 22nd of August, 1485, after 200 or 300 years, the House of Plantagenet in the male line has been removed from the English throne, and we now have a new royal house, one occupied by a man of Welsh, French, and just a little bit of English ancestry, and that is Henry Tudor.
Wow. That is fantastic. Yeah, and like you said, the end of the Plantagenet line, it finishes with Richard III, doesn't it? And so a lot of these people that defect, is that, again, going back to your comment earlier about them not really liking Richard. So Richard's reign is not greatly liked then during that short period of time that he's on the throne.
Well, the problem for Richard is the way that he's taken the throne is quite divisive. Um, it's shrouded in a bit of controversy then and now. And we've got to remember that Richard's power base was in the north of England. So when he comes sweeping south to take control of the throne, a lot of the southern gentry and a lot of the southern officials are not taken with this. For one, for their own self-interest, of course. They stand to lose a lot of their offices and a lot of their power to this northern power base. But also, they think the Richards killed the princes in the Tower. And they cannot stand by this because they swore their allegiance to the sons of Edward IV. They didn't swear their allegiance to Edward's brother. So this is why the House of York, it just fractures in upon itself. And the ones who do not support Richard III, they go to Henry Tudor's side, but this is the crucial bit. They're not supporting Henry Tudor just because Henry Tudor is Henry Tudor. They're supporting him because they make him do a pact. And the pact they make Henry Tudor do is to agree to marry Edward IV's daughter, the sister of the missing princess in the Tower, Elizabeth of York. If Henry Tudor is willing to marry Elizabeth of York so that she becomes queen and that that side of the House of York gets back close to the throne of England, then they would make him their king. Henry Tudor's got no choice. He's a poor, landless exile who is now 28 years old. He has no power of his own. He's going to be killed at some point or other. He agrees to this deal. And he does come back to England and he does marry Elizabeth of York. And these Yorkists who support him, they do recoup a lot of the power that they had under Edward IV. So the settlement is made. What I will say is I'm sure some of these Yorkist supporters thought they were going to get a puppet on the English throne. They didn't foresee they would get one of the most strongest-minded, resolute kings of England there ever would be. A man who would not share power with anyone.
No. And the thing is, what he's, some of the stuff you described that he's been through, it's not surprising, really. I mean, the guy's had to literally fight for his life many times. And, he's come out on top every time. So this has made him a very strong person, I would imagine, Anyway, he does have to solidify, doesn't he, his rule. And from what I understand, the ending of the Wars of Roses will come from another battle. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, so many people think the Battle of Bosworth was the final battle of the Wars of the Roses. In truth, it was 2 years later, the Battle of Stokefield in Nottinghamshire. Essentially, Henry Tudor becomes Henry VII, and, he does try to be the figure of reconciliation. This idea of merging the White Rose and the Red Rose into the Tudor Rose, it's not nonsense. It wasn't made up by Shakespeare or late historians. This is what Henry tries to do. He tries to be a king for all, because that's the only way you are going to end the wars and the conflict in this country. He's a unity candidate. But there are a few supporters of Richard III who have now lost their power. And they look to reverse the triumph. At the end of the day, if someone like Henry Tudor can become king, then surely anyone is game to become king. And there is, during this time, another young Yorkist prince still alive. The two princes in the Tower, we don't know what happened to them. I believe they were murdered, but we simply do not know what happened to them. But there is another Yorkist prince still alive, and he's called Edward, the Earl of Warwick. And now this small Yorkist rebellion tries to put Warwick on the throne. The problem is they don't have Warwick. Warwick is in the Tower of London, locked up. So they find a small boy to impersonate Warwick. He's the boy we remember today by the name Lambert Simnel. This Yorkist conspiracy, they go to Ireland, they find themselves an Irish army, they buy German mercenaries, and they basically try to copy what happened at Bosworth 2 years earlier. It doesn't work. They get to Stokefield, and Henry Tudor's army completely destroys them. This would not be a rerun of Bosworth, and it would not be a change of dynasty, but it did come very close to doing so. But Henry, he emerges victorious. He has done what Richard III didn't do, and that's defend his crown on the battlefield and win.
Yeah, lovely. And again, so let's talk about his reign then. So one of Henry's most significant acts is marrying Elizabeth of York, I believe. And but what is his rule like once he becomes king and he crushes any rebellions or anyone that opposes him?
So it's probably better to look at Henry's reign as a total rather than going through it step by step, because that would be very
Yeah, that's
very
right.
complex and quite onerous. But the truth is, when we get to Henry's death in 1509, he has ended the Wars of the Roses. Now, people quibble about that because of Stokefield, the battle that I've just mentioned. And it is true that by becoming King of England, Henry hasn't automatically ended the wars. That's what he himself and his biographers would want us to think. And that's what William Shakespeare very famously in his play Richard III had us think. Henry, by becoming king, in that very moment, the wars are over. That's not the case. He had to work very hard across the next 24 years of his reign to bring that into being. And he does that really, I think, by three things. He restores royal authority, he replenishes the royal treasury, and he rehabilitates England's continental reputation. Let me just try and break that down just a little bit. So he restores royal authority, first of all. England has been drifting in and out of wars and battles for 30 years. Now, he realizes that this can't go on. There can't be any more overmighty nobles with the power to make and unbreak kings. So he goes after his own nobility. He takes away their claws, so to speak. He does that by financial pressure. He levies threats of fines upon his nobility. He doesn't want another Warwick the Kingmaker. He doesn't want another Richard III. He doesn't want nobles taking control of the throne. He also wants to enforce law and order. If you can enforce law and order throughout the realm, then people are going to be less likely to have any issues and are going to be less likely to join rebellions or uprisings. So he sends out, justices of the peace throughout his kingdom. He introduces something called the Court of the Star Chamber so that he can deal very quickly with any cases that involve the higher classes. So it's all very kind of boring and bureaucratic, but it does work. Secondly, he replenishes the treasury. For too long, kings of England had been in thrall to their nobles and to Parliament, and this makes them weaker. If they're having to beg for money, it makes kings weaker. Henry did not want his crown to be vulnerable. So yes, there is a point where he becomes something of a financial tyrant in taking money from everybody. His taxes are such a burden to his people. It means that by the end of his reign, he is feared and he's not loved. He is not a popular king. But he makes himself richer than any other king of England there has been. And if you're richer than your opponents, you stand apart from them. And it is ruthless and it is avarice and it does muddy his reputation. But it worked. And finally, his continental reputation, England's continental reputation. Henry invaded England using French support. The House of Lancaster before that were put back on the English throne by French support. Edward IV won his crown back with Burgundian support. Henry knew the importance of making sure England's enemies were not meddling in her affairs any longer, and so he arranged a complex web of treaties. At times he did fall foul of England's enemies. He did go to war with France and with Scotland, but by the end of his reign, he had treaties in place with the Spanish, the French, the Scottish, and the Burgundians. He made his enemies his friends. And this kept England out of pointless wars. England wasn't wasting money going to wars and trying to do stupid things like take over the Kingdom of France once again. He was a pragmatic king who wanted to keep his kingdom prosperous. All of these things played a part in Henry remarkably reaching 24 years on the throne. Nobody could have said that would have happened when this nobody became king at Bosworth in 1485. He makes it to 1509. He defeats all his rivals for the throne. He overcomes a series of pretenders who challenge his authority. England is not invaded by foreign powers. And he dies aged 52 in 1509. Now, this is the crucial bit. This is the point I'm getting to. People say the Wars of the Roses ended in 1485. Some say 1487 with the Battle of Stokefield. I would make an argument for 1509 because Henry VII dies. And when he dies, he passes his crown onto his 17-year-old son, Prince Henry, now Henry VIII. This is the first uncontested transferal of power from father to son in 87 years. All previous kings had not done what they were supposed to do, which is to oversee a successful succession. Henry VII does so. If he had been overthrown, if he had died a couple of years earlier, that boy who now becomes king would have been killed, he would have been removed, and the Tudors would have been extinguished. That doesn't happen. Henry VII gets to 1509, he gets to the point that his son is a towering beast of a teenager, and he hands over his crown. Henry VIII, it's hard to remember this knowing how his reign would turn out, but when Henry VIII comes to the crown, he is one of the most popular figures who has ever governed a kingdom anywhere in Europe. The people of England love him, and they love him because he represents a new dawn. This truly is the boy who is both York and Lancaster. He is the very emblem of the end of the Wars of the Roses. He is the Tudor Rose. So I would make an argument that Henry VII did the job he needed to do, which is to get to Henry VIII to end these dynastic wars. And the wars are ended. We can argue there's the odd Yorkist rebellion or Yorkist claimant later on, but those aren't serious rebellions. Henry VIII, as the direct heir of York, as the son of Elizabeth of York, he is the man who ends the Wars of the Roses just by being.
Wow. Awesome. Yeah. And again, he's going to lay the groundwork so England becoming this prosperous, and I know there are turbulent times ahead with certain things, especially the English Civil Wars later on. But, like when you think about it, so he sort of really gives birth to, I know it's a long, long way away, but Britain, as in like the riches and the becoming this stable country in Europe, and again, there's turbulent times, but,
Yeah, he does. And obviously we can't grant him the incredible foresight of the British Empire, for an example. But this is a man with incredible vision. Everything about Henry VII is vision and propaganda and projecting the grandness of his family line. This is why probably when he's sitting in a small castle somewhere in Britain, he's got plenty of time to think about this when he's kids. He makes incredible usage of Welsh propaganda as the son of prophecy, projecting himself as a national deliverer to bring back the time of King Arthur. This is Henry's whole point. He's a man of vision. And we've got to remember, the Royal Navy begins, in essence, with Henry VII, in that whilst there were previous kings of England who obviously had mighty naval forces, Henry VII, I believe I'm correct in saying, invests in the first dry dock in Portsmouth in about 1497. And this would be the real launching pad for what would become the force that would take literally the world by storm. We could sit here and argue all day long about the consequences, the moral fibre of the British Empire, but it is a historical fact that it did go on to take over the world and transform this. I mean, what are we? We're an island backwater on the edge of Europe for
Yes.
so long to make us the global power. Again, we can't credit Henry directly for that, but he definitely started to sow the seeds of what was what was possible. Let's look at his campaigns to try and find a new world. He financed John Cabot to go off to find the new world, or at least, try and find more than Christopher Columbus had a couple of years previously. A man of expansionist vision. And this is the crucial point here. Henry, like previous kings of England, was focused on the English succession, but he wasn't just focused on that. In 1497, he married his daughter, Margaret Tudor, into the Scottish royal family. And this was hugely controversial at the time because it was the first time an English princess had married a Scottish king in over 200 years, because for that period, England and Scotland were at war, of course. And Henry's English councillors were telling him, English princesses do not marry Scots. They are beneath us. And Henry batted them away. He wasn't having any of that. He was a man of vision. I would argue he was also a Welshman. And I believe a Welshman raised outside England who had not stepped foot into England until the moment he essentially became king at 28 years old. He wasn't susceptible to a lot of the previous prejudices, and he saw the possibilities rather than the problems. And he said, no, I'm going to marry my daughter into the Scottish line, and then my descendants will one day sit on the Scottish throne, which is what happened. Could Henry have ever foreseen a point where his male line would fail, which it did under Elizabeth I? And could Henry have foreseen that if that line failed one day, the Scottish would be there to come down as a second line? I think he did. Now, of course, the consequence of that is the eventual union of England and Scotland and the formation of the British Empire. So, long story short, we can't credit him with what happened a couple of hundred years later, but he certainly is the linchpin that made that happen. Would all of those connections have occurred had the Plantagenets stayed on the English throne? I would argue no. I'd argue possibly the most likely option would be England might very well have eventually have taken over Scotland militarily rather than a political union, which is what happened.
Wow, so interesting. Yeah. Okay, mate. So that's Henry VII. But I'd like you to sum him up in a few words, Henry VII, if you could.
A pragmatic, focused, resilient winner.
Yes, that's it. That's the one. Okay, mate. Well, now we're going to talk about yourself because obviously, you've got some great books out there, and you've got a few good books, and one that really jumped out at me, which I'll get to in a minute. Well, they're both here actually. So these are your earlier books. You've obviously got Tudor Wales because you're a proud Welshman, I understand.
Yeah.
So tell us about, and I like that. I like the York pubs. I mean, come on. I mean, who doesn't love a pub? So tell us the idea behind your first early little books there, and how just tell us about those.
So I was very simply writing blogs. Again, I was a journalist graduate, but I never went into journalism. But I never lost the love of writing. So in my mid-20s, I opened a blog and I was writing about just anything and everything that took my fancy. Gradually, they were becoming more Tudor focused. And it was around this period that Susanna Lipscomb released an extraordinary book called A Visitor's Companion Guide to Tudor England. It's essentially a guidebook. And I had a bit of a bee in my bonnet, not with Susanna, who I know and like a lot, but a bit of a bee in my bonnet about the Tudor England market and how the Welsh Tudor related sites were being just completely ignored. Which I'm thankful to say is not the case all these years later. So I wrote a blog looking at the Tudor sites in Wales, Raglan Castle, Tenby, Pembroke Castle, all of these magnificent locations that people visit because of their Welsh history, but not because of their Tudor connections. And if we could tap into that vast Tudor market that is out there, multi-million-pound market, and try and bring some of those to Wales, this will be only good for our economy. So this is my thinking. And I wrote a blog, and a publisher, Amberley, got in contact, and we transformed it into the book you see in front of you. Now, when that was published, and it was all done and dusted, and I had upheld the lifelong dream of having a book in my hands, I just moved to York. And the publisher mentioned, we have this series of books about local pubs. Why don't you do one on York? And I thought, come on, what a project that is. I've just moved to the city. The place is covered in pubs.
I love it.
It would be extraordinary. I will say it was a very, very boring subject to write, and I hated every minute of it. And I'll tell you why. I thought I would just go into the pubs, have a couple of pints, and the book would write itself. I spent that entire year in the library, going through street directories, every single year trying to find who was the landlord of the pub in 1876, and then going through newspaper reports. I would say it was very good for me to master a different aspect of archival research. And it gave me a lot of the skills that I was able to then take forward, but it wasn't as fun as people think it was.
No, so you thought it was going to be, let's go to the pub and get drunk every night, karaoke, and all that, and then you end up in the archives. That's fantastic, though. It's a great story, mate. Seriously, I think it's great. No, it's really good. And again, now I bet when you go to York, you're like, all the pubs. So when you go to York and I'm there, I'm going to hang out with you. If that's all right.
Yeah, I can definitely pinpoint the best places to go.
You're going to have to do a pub guide, mate. That's what you're going to have to do. Oh, that's great. So good. Okay, let's talk about this amazing book. 2017 is this one? You released this one. So again, really delving into the House of about Balford, and so tell us about how that went about.
Yeah, so I'm pleased that I was able to do 2 guidebooks first, because it allowed me to really work out the industry, work out how to promote yourself, and understand a lot of the writing process, rather than delving in to what I call my first real proper book, a full study, a hardback examination of, it says what it is on the tin, the House of Beaufort. Now, this is essentially born from the fact that I wanted to learn more about Henry VII's maternal ancestors, and quite frankly, there wasn't any accessible book out there. We have a few academic studies going back to the 1980s and the 1950s, and that's it. There's nothing out there about the Beauforts for a general audience to read. And this also ties into the fact, something that not many authors will tell you, but it's true. We don't always... When we're choosing projects to write, there has to be the idea of the market in place. We can't always write the subject we want to write about because, well, we'd all end up writing the same thing. You have to come up with a fresh angle and a fresh perspective. And I touched on the point of, there's no need for me to write a book about the Wars of the Roses in a period when about 10 books on the Wars of the Roses were being released. I can't say anything different than what's already been said by Matthew Lewis, Dan Jones, people of that ilk. So I determined upon writing a book about the Beauforts so I could examine for myself Henry's ancestry. It is an interesting subject that not many people have written about, and it comes at the Wars of the Roses and the 100 Years' War from a completely different perspective many people have never considered, and that's from the Beaufort's perspective. They've always been sideline characters in the stories of others, and I wanted to see things from their side.
Excellent. Yeah, brilliant, mate. That's great. And then of course this is another book that you wrote in 2021. And again, so tell us the idea behind that. Is that just you wanted to sort of follow up from the previous book?
Yes, it's a similar thinking point, really. I still don't feel ready to publish a biography on Henry VII. It feels like an overwhelming subject that's very difficult to try and think of how to approach it. And quite
Hmm.
frankly, there have been quite a few excellent Henry VII academic studies
Hmm.
that still hold up, and they work in how they're structured. But I noticed something that Chris Skidmore, the historian and former politician, said once about getting a golden thread and taking it through your book from start to finish and never losing track of your golden thread. Whatever your subject is, don't get distracted. Stick to your theme from A to Z. And I've said that to historians repeatedly who move into writing from now on. And that was the concept with this. This book allowed me to write about the reign of Henry VII, but from one particular aspect, his struggles with Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck. And this is what this book is. It follows Henry VII all the way through his reign. It covers all of his major points, but it never loses the focus of this particular vantage point of his life and of his struggles. And in many ways, it couldn't have been more timely because there is obviously a lot of debate at the moment about the princes in the tower allegedly being discovered alive and the case being solved. And a lot of people are interested in the case, the princes in the tower. It's also an A-level subject now. So this book actually was quite, I didn't intend it to be, but it did prove to be quite timely. And it's proven quite popular because it doesn't come at the princes in the tower, and it doesn't come at Simnel and Warbeck from a let's look at who they really were point of view. It's what did they do that matters, not who they were. What did they do? Because the actual history that happened, is fascinating rather than getting caught up in the who's.
Yeah, fantastic, mate. Really good. And recently in 2024, you released another fantastic book, and this is The Son of Prophecy, The Rise of Henry Tudor. So is this going back sort of like you said, so it's the rise. So what inspired you to write this one?
This is the book I always wanted to write. And I'm glad that I was able to wait to this point in my career to do so, because I now have the public profile to make sure it doesn't get overlooked
Mm.
or dismissed. It's it is the Welsh Tudors. It is the ancestry of the Tudor family, the origins of the Tudor family, up to the point that they become kings and queens. Because I actually find after 1485 is boring. Not boring, but it's not quite as exciting as what comes before 1485. And people are always in a rush to get to the point of the Tudors. In fact, they're in a rush to jump straight to Henry VIII. They're not
Yes.
looking at all of the exciting chaos and drama and intrigue that comes before it. And this is a Welsh story, but it's a Welsh story with English consequences. And I would love to get a Welsh audience to read about the Tudors, and I would love to get an English audience to read about Welsh history. And this is this book. And it is fascinating because the history is entwined and it's murky, it's complex, it's messy, but it's also incredibly entertaining. And this book is full of stories that people have quite frankly never heard of. Even your most high achieving expert Tudor historian has not come across the content in this book before. So, and I've been told that by many of them. So it is a fascinating deep dive into the origins of the Tudors. They did not come out of anywhere. To understand the Tudors, to paraphrase that god awful or amazing TV show, The Tudors, you need to go back to the beginning.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's defined by its own era. I know it's art well after all of this, but the Tudor period, Henry VIII, like I said. But I like the fact that you've gone. Do you know what? Let's look at how we get to that point. And seriously, I mean, Nathan, all I can say, mate, is I mean, your passion is infectious. And you're bloody fantastic, really. So thank you for like coming on the podcast and explaining this. And I like the fact that you're, putting the highlight on the Welsh side of the story because it's been washed over, hasn't it?
Yeah, the Tudors fall into a really awkward gap. In Wales, they're viewed as just the kings of England
Yeah.
who were traitors. They went off to England, they became kings of England, and they caused every war that Wales has ever had to this day. And that's nonsense. They're very misunderstood in Wales today. In England, of course, the Welsh aspect was removed by the Victorians because they lived in an age of English exceptionalism and the greatness of England and empire.
Mhm.
And Welsh history is just not at the forefront of the national English consciousness. So they fall within the gap. And hopefully I can try and rewrite a little bit of that in my small corner of the world, at least.
Well, I'm so glad that you've decided to do that and bring shine light on it because again, it's fantastic. I just can't say anything else about it. Well, Nathan, honestly, mate, it's been an absolute pleasure to, talk to you about your passion because when you meet someone with a passion, it's nothing better, it's just, it's amazing. And all that is left to say, my friend, is cheers.
Yeah, cheers. It's morning, so it'll have to be a cup of coffee.